In this exercise, we're going to take a look at the Blender map exporter that will allow the export of mesh objects as brush volumes for BSP editing. So that's essentially derivatives of idTech. So Quake 3, Quake 2, Quake 1, Doom, etc. What this will allow us to do is create something in Blender using meshes that can then be exported as a .map file and imported into Radiant, or a different version flavor of Radiant. So first things first, the script will need to be downloaded and installed. So once we've downloaded the script in Blender, as with other scripts and add-ons, we need to be in the Blender Preferences. So Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and then we just click on the Install button. Browse to the location of the file where it was downloaded or saved to. Select, and then click on Install Add-on. And once installed, then click the checkbox to activate, and then take a look at any information that may be provided with the script. And as we can see in the expansion, we've got some additional defaults. But for now, we just need to enable and then close the Preferences dialog. So that now means if we go into the File menu, Export, we have the Quake.map exporter. So that's the script all set up and ready to be used. Now, to make content for BSP based games, we need to set up the environment, in this case the units, and the grid. So in Scene Properties, we want Units, Expand. We need to set the unit system to None. That will disable a unit scale, which will then allow, in Viewport Overlays, access to subdivisions. Because what we want to be able to do, which we can't do in Metric or Imperial, is change the subdivisions of the grid to make the content that's made more compatible with Radiant and the environment that Radiant presents to us. So Metric to None, and then in Viewport Overlays we want to set the scale of the grid to 8, and then the subdivisions to 8 also. And what this does is it replicates the grid that's in Radiant. It's subdivided by 8, so each major subdivision is formed from 8 smaller subdivisions. So this is a grid that's 8 by 8. So if we look at the grid in Radiant, we can see the grid is 8 by 8. We want to match that in Blender to make the process of creating content in Blender and then editing it in Radiant much easier. So that's step 2, setting up Blender's environment to match Radiant. So step 3 is looking at how meshes are treated as brush volumes. So essentially, all mesh objects are not meshes, but brush volumes. This is what BSP map data works from, brush volumes. Everything is a volume. So the minimum size object that we want to be working with as a general rule of thumb is 8 units. So that's 1 grid square. This corresponds to the height of 1 step within a set of stairs. So View, Sidebar. This is so we can see the size of our object. Make sure it's selected. Item. So we can see at the moment it's 2 by 2 by 2. When we're making levels, we need to make sure that that is 8 at a minimum. 8 by 8 by 8. So that is our smallest object. We also want to make sure, for the ease of working with this environment, we want to make sure that our origins are, generally speaking, going to be in the corners of our objects, or we have our objects properly aligned to the grid. So we're using the widget and moving those so they sit on the grid. So that might be Control to snap and or Control Shift to snap to smaller increments. So we want our objects to be aligned to the grid as much as possible. So we've got our smallest object, so 8 by 8, and that object should be aligned to the grid as much as possible. For export, we also need to make sure that our objects are reset. So the scale of this, because we changed the object's dimensions, we've changed the scaling, which now has to be reset. So we select our object and make sure from Object, Apply, All Transforms, or Rotation and Scale. So this needs to reset scale to 1, which it does, and that now means that all objects are scaled correctly when they are exported. So in terms of how our meshes are treated by the map exporter, we need to look at them from the point of view of volumes or brushes, so that is solid shapes, and they need to be convex. That is, they are cubic or rectilinear shapes absent indentations. So something like this, with an inset and an indentation, are invalid shapes. If we wanted to export something like this, we would have to break the cube up into segments so that we created separate volumes for each face in order for this to be a valid brush-based object. This would be exported as a mesh object otherwise, as a proper model. Let's just undo that. We also want to make sure that all our objects, when we make something, are separate and individually selectable. So let's make a quick scene. So we'll quickly go into edit mode. Just make a quick object. So snapping to the grid using Control and or we could enable snap so that it does that without us having to constantly hold the Control key down. So we've got a base object. I'm going to duplicate this. Snap that up. Edit mode. Just going to make a little plinth. Exit. Duplicate. Escape to reset. Edit mode. 1, 2. 1, 2. Duplicate, escape to reset, move that up, edit mode, duplicate, escape, edit mode, So we'll just make a small alter. So we've used the 8 units as our smallest unit, so these will form a set of steps, and then we've made sure that everything is locked to the grid. So each of these is an independently selectable object. We do not want to combine these into a single object like we would normally do. So we can see in the outliner we have a single object. We want to avoid doing that for brush volumes. So this is now a concave shape. These are invalid. You need to make sure that all the shapes are convex, which means that they retain their cubic or rectilinear shape. So if we save this, File, Save As, Alter Test, Save. This would then ensure that during export each of these would be converted correctly into a brush volume. So that's the basics of how mesh objects are treated. So aside from that, our scenes, what we do in the scene, can be modeled in exactly the same way we'd normally do. So add mesh cube. So we essentially want to be working with objects that are always going to be primitive shapes. Let's make this 32 by 32 by 72, because this gives us a representation of our default character. View, viewpoint, front, align this to the grid. So hold shift because we are in snap already. So that's our player character, and this is our large alter object. Each of these is a separate object or a separate mesh. Let's save that. So in terms of brush volumes, that's all we need to know. When it comes to curved shapes, we want to make sure that we are sticking to this rule. So all our objects that are used to make a curve remain. So let's try and do a curve. They remain solid objects. And let's duplicate this, move that to the side, edit mode. Let's go into wireframe. So we can see through the mesh. Vertex select. I'm going to use our widget. That's face 1, duplicate. Face 2. Duplicate. Face 3. So everything is aligned to the grid to make the process easier. So that's a curve. If we need smoothing on this, so we need that curve to be smoothed, we would export this as a model, an actual mesh model, and then assign a smooth group or mesh smoothing to it. But for brushes, brush volumes, this is how we make our curves. Let's just clip start, type 1. So the default clip start may need to be adjusted as well. But that's a curve. So now that we've got that, let's just play around with it a little bit just to make something a bit more substantial. So escape, rotate, hold Control, snap to the grid, move, shift, smaller increments, top view. Let's just hide these. So select, object, show hide, H. So that we can align this group to the grid. And if we're still out, what we can do is select our objects and use our coordinates. And we need to be precise with this so that we don't cause inadvertent problems when it comes to the level eventually being compiled to a BSP. Because this introduces the potential for rounding errors. That's errors to do with the precision of the calculations used to describe our objects. So we can check these. So let's unhide. So show hide, show hidden objects. So that's Alt-H. So let's make an adjustment to this. Move these out of the way. Make this a bit of a face select. Viewpoint front, that is at the bottom. So let's save this, file, save, just saving over the previous version. So let's say this is our example brushwork. This is the level of the objects that we are exporting. In fact, let's move this over here so that we've got essentially a pillar and an alcove of some description. So what we can do once we've got all of this, for clarity, for the ease of working in Blender, we can assign materials. So let's select the player character first, materials, and for this, generally speaking, so click on new, let's call this player, preview, change the color, and of course we need to be in material preview to actually see the material colors. Let's just call this stone. That's the pre-existing or pre-assigned material to our objects. Let's make this a slightly greyish brown. So now we can distinguish which elements are part of the scene. So in terms of a functional brush volume, something that can be exported from Blender, this is all we need to do in terms of material assignments. It is possible to then assign, in Shading Workspace, it is possible to then assign images to our material. So add texture, image texture. Or we can just drag and drop an image from an external source. Open. Let's find an image. Let's just use this one at the top. So that is now going to be assigned to our brush volumes, which will be exported, or at least the exporter will write the material path into the map file, which is then picked up in Radiant as a shader path. What we can also do is assign multiple materials to our objects. So if we go back into Layout, and expand some of these objects out of the way so that we can see each surface. Now, whether this is needed depends on the game environment that's being edited. So we can select all of our objects, go into edit mode. We only need to keep certain surfaces. So select all, deselect, deselect. So we only need to select or deselect surfaces that are going to be visible. Then we can add another material instance, new material that populates, assign that to those selected surfaces, and as we've got multiple objects selected, we have to do that several times. But what this does is set the brush volume up so that we can then cull it during the compile process, so that this is effectively Caulk. So as much work as we can do within Blender to optimize the process of making our objects easy for the compile process, we can assign materials. So let's call this Caulk. So edit mode, object mode, move these back into position. So these surfaces will now be culled during the compile process. So these objects now have two materials. So essentially we can have multiple materials assigned to our objects so long as they are clearly delineated. So now that we've got all of that, this is our test scene. We're about ready to try and export. So let's save as. So the prep for exporting, essentially we just need to make sure that all our objects are scaled, rescaled. That obviously might mean selecting the whole group, make sure one of them is active, and then object, apply, rotation and scale. That resets everything. We don't need to worry too much about the origin points per se, except in relation to helping us align our objects to the grid to alleviate the amount of work that we might then have to do in Radiant or our level editing tool. But once we've got all of that, that's basically it. We've got our material assignments with textures and material assignments without texture. Multiple materials assigned to certain objects, single material to others. We've made sure that our objects are aligned to the grid. Even our brush-based curves. So all we need to do now is drag out a selection, make sure we only include the components that we need to include and or that are valid to the map format. So that might mean deselecting camera object and or lights if we don't want to include lights. So that's our selection. Make sure one of them is the active object, so shift click and then File, Export, Quake Map. So we'll get the dialog with a set of properties. So as mentioned at the beginning, this is a replication of the settings that are presented in Preferences. So it needs to be highlighted here that there's going to be a degree of trial and error testing the settings to get the right combination, because different editing environments will have slightly different requirements that will break a map export for one editor, but the same file will work in another. So there's going to be some trial and error in terms of testing the options that are available. But for a standard map file that will be openable in Radiant, we want selection only because we've selected the objects that we want to include. Apply transform and apply modifiers. Those are okay. Disable triangulate. That comes later during the compiling of the map. In object type, we want meshes to be set as brush volumes. NURBS are not being included, should be avoided. Ignore. Light. Ignore because there aren't any lights in the scene. And empties can be ignored because there aren't any entities, empty entities in the scene. Coordinates, grid. Now this should replicate the settings that we used for the grid itself. So that's 8. Click type 8. Depth, this relates to the script extruding brush volumes from flat planes. We want to avoid using this if we're doing standard or classic map editing. This needs to be set to 0 to disable that function. Scale, that's okay. Precision, that's okay. Output format. Planes, we've got classic Quake or classic.map files or the modified Doom.map files, which include different data. So for standard, we want Quake. UVs, set that to standard. Flags, there are no surface flags, so none. And output, we want to output a file, so select that. Miscellaneous, everything else is okay, apart from the option of changing material to Caulk, and that'll be the default material. This will save us some time retexturing everything. Save that. We've got our file name and our location. So it's click export. So that exports the file that we can now open in Radiant. So in Radiant, all we need to do, file, open. So we're just opening a standard map file, open, browse to the location of the file. There it is. Alt-test, select, open, and there is our brushwork. And of course, with access to all the materials and the game assets, we can then reassign textures and materials. And because we took the time to make sure that everything is snapped to the grid, we also have all our objects similarly snapped to the grid. So that is using Blender essentially as a level editing tool to create maps and levels that can be exported using the export script that will export .map files that can then be opened in Radiant.